Heidi hi, sociologists, social movements, 13. Unlucky for some, but not us. Our learning goals for this lesson are: you're going to know what social power is, or power as it pertains to society. Very important topic. And you're going to know 4 common responses to power. You're going to know Max Weber's 3 types of power. And you're going to be able to analyze how power is used. Yep. 4 learning goals. Madness. Alright then, power. Let's do it. So power is the ability to influence the actions of another person or institution, even if they resist. Yeah. If you're influencing them and they wanted to do it anyway, not really power. So it's all about trying to get people to do stuff if they're resisting. Here's a quote: "Power is the chance to impose your will, even when opposed." And that's by none other than Max Weber. He's a German. Power can be positive or negative. Now, you might remember a few different power diagrams. This is one from ancient Egypt with the pharaoh on the top, and then the vizier and the nobles and the scribes, craftsmen, and the farmers. There's another one if you ever did shogunate Japan. You had the emperor at the top and the merchants at the bottom. Here's just another random one. That's just a fun picture, isn't it? And here's a pretend one that some paranoid person came up with for what they reckon is going on Earth right now. The financial elite. I'm not saying this is true. This was just an interesting diagram. The idea behind this one being that corporates and big banks have more power than people. Interesting thought. So there's a power hierarchy, yeah? Some people got more power, some people have got less. Older people usually got more power than young people. You guys as students are pretty close to the bottom of the power ladder or triangle or pyramid. Okay. So if you've got legitimate power and it's recognized as legitimate, there's a few different ways that people respond. You might freely obey that legitimate power. So perhaps a friend says, "Do you want to come over to my house?" And you go, "Yeah." You think they've got legitimate social power, so you agree. Of course, if you're locked down in your house, you'd have to Zoom it or house party it. Who knows? The second response to legitimate power, you might obey because you think that you're going to gain something. So maybe you're doing a business deal. You think, yeah, the other business person's got legitimate power. I'll agree to their use of that power because I'm going to get something out of this deal as well. You might simply believe that that person has got legitimate power. For example, a teacher giving you an order. At the end of each of these videos, I say, do this homework, and you do it because you believe I have legitimate power. I hope. Or obedience due to patterns of inequality. So you might acknowledge that the power is legitimate, but it's not really a fair situation, but because it's been going on for so long, there's a pattern of that inequality. For example, a slave following commands. That's just a random slide. There's quite a few different ways to divide up types of power. So Max Weber's 3 types, which you're going to see in a minute. A really common one that you find online has 5 different types of power. You've got referent power, relationship power, blah, blah, blah. In this sociology course, we don't talk about that stuff. And so, yeah, there are the 5. So another theorist came up with these 5 power types: legitimate, reward, coercive, referent, expert, and possible responses. That's just for funsies. We don't talk about those types. Okay, back to it. So, social movements with more power means they've got more resources, means they're more likely to succeed. I know that seems fairly obvious, but, you know, assume that the person that you're talking to knows nothing and tell them even the basic stuff. And that definitely holds for the responses that you write. And it's also true that individuals with more power can do more stuff, so they might be more able to resist the change that you want to bring in. Yeah. So if you're a social movement and you're trying to carry out social change, you need to think, who are the individuals with a lot of power? They are going to find it easier to resist. Here's a perfect example of some powerful individuals. That's Bill and Melinda Gates. I think he's the second wealthiest person in the world. Also has a huge endowment fund, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is a massive charity, which, you know, most of his private wealth is being funneled through that foundation, and so they have a huge amount of power, and they take on a lot of causes, so they provide funding for a lot of different social movements. And he did not invent the coronavirus. Okay, Weber's 3 types of authority. Firstly, he said there was a type of authority called traditional authority. That's obviously based in tradition, such as the king or the queen or a father in a family. Then you've got rational legal, that's the second type. So that's based on an official role. For example, your boss, a teacher, the cops, or some experts. So if there's an epidemiologist telling you stuff about a pandemic, they would have authority based on their official role of having expertise in diseases. And thirdly, we have charismatic. So that's based on the charisma and the interpersonal influence of the person. For example, celebrities. We say that, you know, celebrities often get asked their opinion on all manner of things that they really don't know anything about, but because they're so charismatic and they have a lot of interpersonal influence, we ask for their opinions about all these kind of weird political things that they probably don't really know that much about. Welcome to life in 2020. Or cult leaders. Much more rare. So, there are 3 types of authority, but any one person or any one group could have power from more than just one of those sources. Yeah. You might be a teacher, but also have charismatic authority. Yeah, you could combine 2 or 3 of them. So, here we go. Here's a little table kind of showing you some examples there. The traditional is long-standing customs, leadership style, historic personality, example, the patriarchy. So that's men ruling everything. Charismatics based on personal qualities, examples, all of those famous charismatic leaders. And the legal rational, that's based on your the office that you hold, the position that you hold, not specifically the individual, making it quite different to charismatic. And some examples are the president, blah, blah, blah. Right. Your activity is you're going to link one type of power to one response to power. I want you to discuss a case study, or if you can't make the case studies we've looked at already fit, then you can make one. I don't mean invent one, I mean use something that you know about. So what I want you to do is think about a case study and think what type of power would be used and what response do you think would occur. So you might go, I'm going to look at feminism. What type of power? Maybe there's a really charismatic feminist leader, and so I will talk about the charisma power that she might use, and perhaps there would be free obedience to the demands that she put out there because of her charisma or whatever. Yep. Pick a case study, link one type of power to one response to power, and tell me a story about what that would look like. Okay, we're going to watch a video called Social Movements, a Primer. It's a really awesome TED Talk. Check it out.
All right, evening, y'all. Let's try that again. Good evening. Thank you. Okay, So according to the title of this night's event, right, one of the things we're supposed to be doing here is inspiring change, like Nick mentioned. So I'm going to take a shot at that. And what I want to focus on is social change. Change where you confront a part of society that's messed up and you try to change it for the better. And I'm hoping that there are a bunch of people in the audience who are already passionate about the idea of social change. And if you're not, you should be. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but the world is like really messed up in a whole bunch of ways and needs to change really bad, like really soon. If you're interested in social change, and I hope you are, then you need to get interested in social movements, because real, serious social change always happens in the context of a social movement, a broad-based, large-scale social movement. Social movements are transformational. They transform all of society, and when you look at the social movements of the past, one thing that's remarkable is that the speed and the depth and the extent of social change that is achieved in a movement always goes way beyond anything that most people were even able to imagine before the movement gets going, right? So that's sort of the promise of social movements. All right, so let's take a look at these. We need to get clear on what a movement is, because the word movement, poor thing, gets abused an awful lot. Here we have a radio station claiming that it's a hit music station, right? So there's like hundreds of these across the English-speaking world that are more or less identical, but this one wants to tell you that if you listen to this station, then you are part of a movement. And if you Google or do an image search on the phrase "join the movement," you will find lots and lots of ads and promotional materials like this telling you that this business or this product or whatever is a movement, and usually that's not quite true. Okay, so what is a movement? All right, well, when I came up here and started talking about social movements, I'm pretty sure that a bunch of y'all in the audience started to think about Occupy, right? And we all called Occupy a movement. The media called Occupy a movement. The people who got involved in Occupy called it a movement. I was one of them. This is one of the big rallies in Occupy Chicago, which happened in October of 2011. I am somewhere in this crowd, I'm not sure where, but I'm somewhere in there thinking to myself, this movement is so awesome. I was really excited, right? But having some distance from it now, I'm here to tell you tonight that Occupy was not, in fact, a movement. Okay, it wasn't a social movement. It resembled a movement. Okay, so what were the characteristics of Occupy that resembled a movement? Well, it spread throughout the country, right? Once it got started in New York, it spread to cities across the country. It brought large numbers of people together. That's a large number of people, if you can't see. And it brought us together around a shared set of grievances, right? We're all pissed off at more or less the same things, right? Inequality, unemployment, the unbalanced political power of the very rich and corporations, especially Wall Street, right? But there's an essential feature of movements that Occupy was lacking, which is direction, okay? Movements move in a direction. That's why they're called movements, right? They move. Movements don't just bring people together, they get people moving together in a particular way, in a unified fashion. And that's something that we never really got in Occupy, right? So just to take the example of Wall Street, right? We all agreed that Wall Street was a problem, but what did we want to do about it? Did we want to take our money out of Wall Street? Did we want to impose new regulations on Wall Street? Did we want to break up the big Wall Street banks? Did we want to take over Wall Street? Well, these ideas were all floating in the air, but there's no unity around it, no unified strategy, and no unified action. Okay, so I'm still a big fan of Occupy. I think it did a lot of good. However, according to the criteria that I'm using here, it did not constitute a true movement. Okay, here's sort of what a movement looks like, or feels like. It's a metaphor, okay? So this big fish here on top, right, this represents some sort of social system. It's a predatory and oppressive system. And at the outset, it's attacking all these little fish, right? And the little fish represent us. They represent the masses. And in the first part, you've got this system attacking all these people, and these people aren't unified, right? They're sort of scattered, and they're trying to deal with the consequences of the system and cope with it on an individual basis. and it's not working out very well. They're just getting gobbled up, right? Okay, part 2. This is when we get a movement together, all right? Here you've got the masses of people united and acting together. They're not just united around a shared set of grievances, they're united in shared action, okay? And together, they have turned the tables on the big fish, on the system that was putting them under attack, and now they're attacking that system and confronting it. And their goal is to, like, if the system is really bad, maybe they want to kill the fish, or maybe if the system is sort of redeemable, they just want to, like, tame and discipline the fish and make it less predatory, right? So it depends on the context, okay? And in the 20th century, we've seen some movements that aim at killing the fish and others that aim at disciplining the fish. Okay. So that's sort of like what a movement looks like. And in a true social movement, this dynamic here spreads throughout all of society. Every part of society somehow gets caught up in the movement. So you have people all throughout society engaged in this dynamic, okay, getting together to attack the big fish. All right. So here's a good example that's probably pretty familiar to y'all, right? The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Okay. In the civil rights movement, people from all across the country, all races, all walks of life, got involved in different capacities for a whole bunch of different reasons in fighting against legalized segregation and institutionalized racial inequality. Okay. It's a big movement. It achieved big things. It transformed all of society. It transformed the relationship that American society had towards race. Okay. It did not end racism, okay, even though we now have an African-American president, and even though certain people on, say, certain cable news networks will tell you that that means that racism is over in this country. It's not true. We are right now within walking distance of neighborhoods where you can see very vividly that racism is still alive and well. Okay? So the movement did not end racism, but it changed the dynamic. Okay? It forced racism into retreat. Okay? Ever since the civil rights movement, racism has been on the defensive. Okay? And that was transformational. All right. So this is an image from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that happened in 1963. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of this later in the year. This is an iconic moment. It's when Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, right? And this is at the height of the civil rights movement. Okay? But if, like me, you're interested in creating a new movement for today, you don't want to just focus on the inspiring heights of the movement. You want to look back to how the movement comes into being in the first place, right? So before you got all these people pouring into Washington, united in purpose, a lot of things had to happen before this was possible. Okay. So let's go back to the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Okay, this was a seminal moment in the civil rights movement. It was one of the main events which got the whole thing started. Okay, and the civil rights the Montgomery Bus Boycott was a much more modest affair than the civil rights movement as a whole, right? The bus boycott was just dealing with the segregated seating plans on the buses in this one city in the South. Okay, that was what it was about. And at the time, the idea of flooding Washington, D.C. With hordes of people from across the country to fight segregation at a federal level and win federal legislation securing rights for all people, that was not really on their radar yet. They were just worried about what was happening on these buses. Okay? But when the bus boycott ended victoriously with the desegregation of the buses in Montgomery, people caught sight of something larger in that victory. Okay? And this is pretty characteristic. Very often, social movements start when you have a successful campaign that is relatively small and relatively limited, but seems to point towards a larger vision of systemic social change, right? People catch a glimpse of like, oh, if we keep doing stuff like this, then, and it keeps working, then, we can just keep going and fix everything, right? Okay. So if, like me, you're interested in getting a new social movement started today, here's your job. all right? You got to figure out what is the system in society right now that needs to be changed, okay? And then you got to get together with an organization that you think is capable of putting together a campaign that's going to land the first blow on that system and get a broader movement going that's going to confront it in a more systematic way throughout society. All right, that's sort of how you want to be thinking about things, and I have some thoughts on what that means for today, but instead of getting into those, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what movements mean on a personal level. Okay. So if you want to get involved in a movement for social change, you got to buckle down. Okay, you got to gird up your loins. It's a great phrase from the Bible, gird up your loins. Okay, because movements are hard work. They're hard work, and they involve risks, right? So Rosa Parks, she kicked off the Montgomery Bus Boycott. In order to do that, she had to go to jail. That was the risk that she had to take. Lots of other people had to take risks like that. Some people had to take much larger risks, right? Some people had to take smaller risks. But everyone who got involved in the civil rights movement had to take some kind of personal risk. That's just part of the game, okay? And I want to look at one example in particular. This is Jim Zwerg. He was part of the civil rights movement. I want to say a little bit about his organization, and then I want to say a little bit about his personal life. Okay. So he was a member of SNCC, SNCC, which stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Okay. This was an organization of students that formed to take part in the civil rights movement, students of all different races. Okay. And SNCC played a crucial role in the movement. They were, even within the context of the leaders of the movement, agitators. They were constantly agitating the other leaders in the movement. That was one of the roles that they played. They were constantly pushing the envelope. Okay, they pushed the envelope in terms of how many people they would mobilize, what they would mobilize for. They pushed the envelope in terms of their principles, in terms of their unwillingness to make what they saw as bad compromises with the status quo. And they pushed the envelope in terms of the risks that they were willing to take. So Jim Zwerg, along with other members of SNCC, they willingly walked into situations where they were pretty sure there is a high risk of people going to try to beat them to death. And as a matter of fact, this guy, along with other members of SNCC, was nearly beaten to death as part of the Freedom Rides, one of the campaigns in the civil rights movement. Okay. Looking back at the role that SNCC played in the civil rights movement, some people have called them the shock troops of the movement. Okay, that was the role that they played. And very often, that's the kind of role that students play in a broader social movement. Okay, they're sort of pushing the envelope. They're playing the role of the shock troops. All right, so a bunch of y'all are students. Hopefully you're interested in social change, which means you're interested in social movements. So another job that you have is to think to yourself, where are you going to find, or where are you going to build today's version of SNCC that's going to be the shock troops of some new movement? Okay, so that's one task that I want to set before y'all. All right, so that's SNCC, the organization that he was a part of. Okay, now I want to say something about his personal life. Okay, so like I said, he was nearly beaten to death, okay, by violent racists in the South. But that wasn't the only kind of opposition that he faced. He also faced a kind of opposition that was more intimate from his parents. Okay. When this guy told his parents that he wanted to get involved in the civil rights movement, they told him to stop. They condemned him. They told him that it wasn't his place, that he shouldn't make trouble like this. His mother told him that his actions were, quote, killing his father. Okay. And now, that's grim stuff to hear from your parents. And I think in a way, this was much harder to deal with than the violent members of the KKK, because, you know, violent members of the KKK, they're on the outside, but the voices of their parents, they get on the inside. Okay, so he ended up with these voices in his head that he had to deal with, telling him that it was just not his place to confront the powers that be in a powerful way, right? And those were like inner demons that he had to deal with. And I think that everyone who wants to get involved in a movement for social change has to confront some version of this, okay, some version of these voices in your head telling you to stop. And to close with, I want to share mine, or one of mine. Okay. So first off, some background. I'm Asian. I say this in case you failed to notice. Maybe you're post-racial and you don't see race anymore. I don't know, but just so you know, I'm Asian. And what does that mean? Well, Time magazine cover from 1987, those Asian American whiz kids. Anyone seen this cover before? I read the story, it's great stuff. Okay, so this is sort of very common image of what it means to be Asian in America today, right? We're supposed to play the game really well, okay, as Asians. The game involves school and SATs and college and getting a career. We're supposed to do all of that stuff extra well, better than everyone else, right? That's sort of what this is saying about our role in society. And the consequence of that, one consequence of that, is that if you're focused on playing the game extra well, then you're not going to spend time calling the rules of the game into question. You're not going to spend time thinking about how the rules of the game might be unfair or oppressive or unjust. You're not going to spend any time getting angry at the game and thinking about how maybe you need to confront it and change it. Okay? So this is an image that gets internalized. I've internalized it. If you're Asian in this country, I bet you've internalized some piece of this. And what that creates is a voice inside of my head saying, this isn't your place. Your place is not to confront the powers that be in a powerful way. Your game is to your place is just to play the game and keep your head down and study hard or whatever. Okay, so that's something that I have to deal with. Like I said, everyone has to deal with some set of voices like this, and it's different for everybody, right? Very often they have to do with being a member of some identity group, being Asian or being a woman, being black, being gay, being disabled, whatever, right? Sometimes it has to do with just things that your parents happen to have told you, like Jim's word. Okay, but for everyone who is socially conscious and maybe their values are pushing you to get involved in a movement for social change, for I think everyone who's like that, there's also these voices in your head telling you to stop, that that's not your place. Okay, and I think that's one of the biggest obstacles for socially conscious people to get involved. The flip side of that is that getting involved in a movement for social change forces you to confront those voices, and that can be a source of personal liberation, okay? Because those voices are oppressive. They tell you lies. Those are the voices of the devil. You got to get rid of it. And when you're forced to confront them, that can be a source of personal liberation, okay? All right. So, sorry, this is supposed to be an image of the light at the end of the tunnel. I was trying to do this metaphor thing. Anyway, okay. To sum up, okay, getting involved in movements is hard work. It involves taking risks. It involves confronting not only the powers that be that exist in society, but also the voices in your head that tell you that that's just not your place, that you should stop doing that and just sit down and be quiet, okay? But getting involved in movements can be transformational on a personal level, and it can also transform society. And like I said at the outset, society is in dire need of getting transformed. So my invitation to you all here is to find some way to get involved in that task. Thank you.
And we're lucky to be able to watch a video specifically about Max Weber's 3 types of authority.
So we also want to talk a little bit about another one of Max Weber's important contributions to sociology, and that's the idea of types of authority. Now recall that he did his work on large political institutions over time, historically, and so he made some observations about how authority presented itself in different types of societies. And he came up with these 3 types of authority. Now we can think of these in terms of being ideal types. We could make a list of the perfect traditional leader, the perfect charismatic leader, the perfect rational legal leader. So we need to know a little bit about what each of these concepts meant in order to make a list of the perfect attributes of each one of these types of authority. So let's start off with traditional authority. Now I want to make a clarification here. A lot of times you'll see these listed in a sort of hierarchical or linear order. That is to say, you'll see them listed from the earliest in time to the latest in time, the most recent. And you see them listed as charismatic, traditional, and then rational legal. I'm listing them this way because I do feel that the charismatic leader has a lot to do with what's going on today with the rational legal type of authority we have. So let's look at traditional authority first. All right, so traditional authority, we can think of this in the West, in contemporary society also, with regard to the notion of patriarchy. We do things in this type of authority situation because we've always done them this way. We don't question this type of authority because it's oftentimes handed down to us from past generations. And so this type of authority is given its legitimacy by custom and by tradition. In other words, if you're a parent, you will probably note that many of your parenting skills and attributes are similar to those of your own parents. I find every day that the older I get, the more similar I become to my mother. I find myself saying some of the same things, rationalizing behavior the same way. I don't question it. You know, in the back of my mind, I go, oh, heck, there's my mom again. But we do it this way under the rule of traditional authority because that's the way it's always been done. And we just don't question whether or not it's right or legitimate. We can think about traditional authority in terms of the kings who used to rule over peasants. We can think about this sort of stage as pre-industrial, when society was hinged more on forcing people to adhere to a strict set of rules and using that traditional authority to make society function. Now, charismatic authority is quite different than traditional authority, although there is a link between the two. We can't really find a clear-cut sort of definition that separates the two. Charismatic authority, we worship these types of leaders, and there can be good or bad charisma. I don't think you can have both at the same time. However, we give these types of leaders their legitimacy because we believe in their ability to reveal the truth of social life to us. We also believe in their magical powers, and we do what they want us to do because we want to please them. We want to appease them. And we have example after example after example of charismatic leadership or charismatic authority over time. In good instances, Jesus was a charismatic leader. Mother Teresa was a charismatic authority. If we look at what's going on in the world today, we could say Desmond Tutu, Bishop Tutu, is a charismatic leader. And so we can also, however, find just as many bad examples of charisma. Hitler is an example of a bad or negative charismatic authority. Jim Jones is another example. Cult leaders in general have a lot of charisma. They are charismatic authorities that people want to follow and want to believe. And so for many people, they never question some of the things that these type of leaders tell them to do. They just do it because they are so enamored and so caught up with that person's charisma and personality that they never question whether or not what they're doing is right or wrong. This is a very, very dangerous type of authority because we don't take the time to rationalize whether or not what we're doing, what that charismatic leader told us to do, is good or positive for us or for other members of society. All right, now the last type of authority that Weber identifies is rational legal authority. And we can think about this one more in terms of contemporary society today. These are our elected leaders. We put them where they are, and their status then as elected officials allows them to rule us. And so when we elect them, We anchor their legitimacy. We tell them by giving them that vote that we are willing to go along with their interpretation of how we should exist as a group. This is central to the rational society, which is what we call our society today. Whether it is or isn't is another story, but we call our society a rational society, and we have to have rational legal authority. Rational leaders whose work is backed up by law. We do what these leaders ask us to do because we put them there. We accept them as our leader, and we're willing then to follow whatever they ask us to do. Now, as I said, charismatic leaders are also, in my opinion, very closely tied to rational legal leaders. I do think that in today's contemporary media-savvy world, where a lot of what we understand is given to us in picture form, that you have to have a certain level of charisma in order for people to accept you as a rational legal leader. And we can again see examples of how charisma plays just by looking at our contemporary political world. We have to have leaders who are photogenic, who can make a good soundbite, who are pleasant to look at, and if we don't have that, then we question their ability as a leader. So I do tend to think, while there are still some attributes of traditional authority in our society, that charismatic leadership is very, very closely tied to rational legal authority. All right, I hope this helps you understand Max Weber's types of authority. We'll talk again soon. Take care.
Your reflection activity is very straightforward. I want you to summarize this lesson in exactly 12 words. Write that in your exercise book. It's homework time. Yippee! Read the relevant pages from the textbook. That's 192 and 193. Now, I want you to classify these things, these dot points, into what type of authority they use. Is it traditional, rational, legal, or charismatic? You can use an acronym there. You can just put a T, R, L, or a C beside it. So here are the types of authority. What type of authority does a teacher have? A parent, the police, parking attendants, director of a movie, the conductor of an orchestra, a bully, or principal, school principal, remember? So just write down those things, and you're putting either a T, an RL, or a C beside it, based on what type of authority they have. The manager of a supermarket, and the Prime Minister. Thank you heaps for being involved and getting stuck into this lesson. Keep it real.